To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether it is nobler to be Solomon or to be the son of David, king of Israel, or to be David, king of Israel, or whether it's better to be just simply you and me. What I want to do is I want to look at Proverbs, but I want to look at it from a different perspective maybe than you're used to seeing or you're used to hearing. Perhaps we don't think of Proverbs too often because we don't talk in Proverbs, or do we? You see, a lot of cliche Christianity is actually proverbial. A lot of the things that you take for granted when it comes to ad copy that you see on advertisements is really Proverbs. Proverbs are simply sayings that fit a certain set of circumstances that are wise for those that are listening to the words that are said and the instructions that are given. The book of Proverbs, as we have them recorded in the scriptures, are meant to be there for a purpose. There's a design to them. God has intended to give them to us to apply to our lives. They are pro-verbs. In other words, they're things to be. When you think of the word verb, it's an action. The verb of an action is whatever the subject material is, it's something to be. So that's what a verb does. It's the action of being something. Proverbs or proverbs would be something to be positive about, or to be professional about, or to be upscale, to be on the right side. So we're going to look at Proverbs, a different way of interpreting it. We're going to take it as proverbs, things to be, the life to be, the life to live, the things that God can give us today from this book of Proverbs. Pro-be, not pro-be, but that's what a pro-be would be proverbs, putting in action of somebody that doesn't have any wisdom to learn to deal with something so that you could learn wisdom. I see myself examining Proverbs and saying, when I look around at people, I don't see people with intelligence and intellect and logic, but rather with feelings and reactions and actions that are often based upon highly suspicious opinions and questionable motivations that I often don't know what happened to the idea of the integrity with which we allow ourselves to think first and speak afterwards. If you were in the presence of a king, you wouldn't shoot off your mouth and say anything you wanted to. You would arrange your conversation. You would coordinate the words that were articulated out of your mouth so they would come flowing from you, so that the person would be knowing what's in your heart and you wouldn't be killed for some of the stupid things you might have said. That's why we're reading Proverbs. That's why we're studying Proverbs. That's why we're looking at Proverbs as something to be. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. Now it's interesting that Solomon isn't remembered for his Proverbs. Solomon isn't really remembered too much for his wives, per se, or his wisdom per se. He seems to always be remembered for basically being the guy that, split the kid in two or whatever, having some kind of wisdom. That's usually the Sunday school story. Or being David's son, building the temple. He's not really given credit though, because it's called Zerubbabel's temple. We're not told that Solomon made this huge, beautiful temple in the glorious time that God and Solomon had together and the wonderful wisdom that he had. We're always seeing just the one thing of his sin and leading Israel down a dark path to a place of God even getting upset with the state of Israel, or the 10 tribes, the 12 tribes. And so Solomon inherits this kind of loose band of men that he's got to suddenly become king over. And the one thing that seemed to unify Israel at the time was the temple. He built what David started and designed, and Solomon just simply used the wisdom that he had to make treaties by marrying all these women. In other words, there was a reason why Solomon had so many wives. Now, he didn't have so many wives as though it were sin unto the Lord. He had so many wives as they were treaties to make peace with the fighting, warring neighbors that he had around him. He, in fact, consolidated his power through women, mostly through conquest of taking a treaty from a nation or from a tribe or from someone around and marrying that spouse or that person to seal the treaty. So Solomon, in some ways, is kind of interesting character to look at if you look in depth to what he was doing and why he was doing them. And that's why we want to look again at Proverbs itself, because we don't always take the perspective of looking at why did he marry so many wives when he knew it wasn't right, or why did he multiply horses when supposedly he wasn't supposed to have so many horses. Horses were a sign of power. They were a means with which you could control all the peoples around, because first of all, you had quicker communication. You had command and control center based upon horses, horseback. You had the opportunities to develop weaponry that would be advanced beyond the infantrymen. So it wasn't a hand-to-hand, person-to-person combat anymore. It was developed by having multiple horses. And so people would begin to trust horses as their quote-unquote tanks, or their implementation of tools that would be used for warfare, rather than using horses for developing the land or for any other reason. And so God was against it, because it would go to the idea that man was self-sufficient without being dependent upon God. And that's kind of what you find in Proverbs, is you begin to see where Solomon, at the time that he records these, gives us some insight into the direction we should go, because God gave him wisdom. God didn't say he used the wisdom. God said, you are wise, and he knew how to rule the people, so he ruled them correctly. He kept them from, at the time that he was ruling them, from being annihilated or taken over by the nations around them. Because when he started his kingdom, he was a factional, fractional, tribal nation that was still warring about who was going to be in charge, to where he ended, the temple was one of the most glorious wonders in the world, and God was honored among the people. So it's kind of interesting if you take a better look at Solomon, and you may want to look at it 2 or 3 times, and kind of begin to grasp where he was coming from a little more than just simply, oh, well, I got money and I got honey, and I'm going to go indulge myself like a bee, to the buzz, or a bee to the hive. No, that's not Solomon. Remember, you have to balance what God says with what the Word of God says, with what we read, because there's portions that are not recorded that we're meant to see some things and experience and know them. But the reality of who the man was God gave him wisdom. God gave him what he asked for. He was a wise man. So now we're looking at the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. And this king of Israel makes it a very interesting place to be in, because Israel itself was not a big nation. They were wandering goatsmen. They were treated as tribal men. They were not treated as educated. They were treated as lessers of the nations. They were treated almost as, you might say, the ethnic groups that we call vagabonds or Bedouins, over in the Middle East. Here we might say they were Latinos. We might say they were just migrant workers. They weren't good for staying in the land. They weren't good for building the land. They were only good for wandering in the land. They were sheep herders. They were goat herders. They were not noted for big construction projects like the Egyptians, or much less too much else. But here we have one of the biggest, most beautiful construction projects beginning, and suddenly the nation going from tribal warfare into what you would say, if we compared it to America, as we were not that big a deal in the early days of America. We weren't really that big a deal in the world powers. I mean, it's sure we won over here, but as far as the rest of the world was concerned, just an upstart nation. That's all. No big deal. They weren't carrying too much. We weren't that big a deal as far as controlling or being able to control anybody else that was in and around the nation of America. We couldn't control the Canadians. We couldn't control Canadians. We couldn't control the French. We couldn't control the British. They came back and fought us again. We couldn't control the trades. We were pretty much a fledgling nation, upstart. And that's what Solomon was with dealing with the nation of Israel. It was an upstart. David had gone out and conquered and fought and won his battles, but it was just as though there were dogs gnawing at the edges of the territories, just waiting to take over. Solomon sealed a lot of his deals with marriage. And so when we look at Proverbs, we're going to look at them from the point of view of being, this is a man who was wise and wily. He was a king, and he understood the place and position of authority and power. He was someone who had absolute authority when it came to being in charge, and he could make a decision of life and death just like that. And at any moment, if you appeared before him, that was how life and death was determined, by the counsel of Solomon. If he said you live, you live. If he said you died, you died. The reason why we keep pushing this about how much we need to understand the background is because then we begin to look at what the proverb means a little different than simply being some kind of American idea of sitting around and saying, hey, I got rights. No, you don't. You have no rights when it comes to the court of the king. When it comes to education, you had no education, because at the time of the temple being built, people were of their family tradition. They were of their family tribe. If your family was a shepherd, you were a shepherd. If you were a stonemason, so too your family was a stonemason. You didn't go off and do your own thing. You did what your father said, and that's the way authority worked. And so in community and that kind of environment, that's where we're finding the book of Proverbs. And that's why when we look at these sayings and these statements, they're not just statements. Some of them are almost like laws. They're almost like edicts. They're telling you something that's going to happen, that he's seen, and they will be applicable to the results of what you do or don't do. They are going to give you a kind of common sense that really is common to that day, but for us has got to be God's sense, so that we can understand that how do we apply a proverb today to fit in our environment when we have a bad mindset and we've got a reprogrammed mind that looks at freedom rather than being under authority. So when we go into Proverbs, I want to take our time on it. We might take only even one proverb at a time, one verse at a time, so that we would better stop and think about it, consider it for a while, meditate on it, maybe look at it again and again. I mean, we won't make more videos about it, but you can think about it over again and again if you have a short video. Then to hurry through it and to just say, oh, well, let's hurry up and get through Proverbs. No. Let's slow down and find what's really insightful, or really the word God wants for us today. So what I want you to think of today from this lesson about Proverbs is Lessons in Proverbs. That's what's a good title for it, is to think of it and remember that Solomon was not out there, adding wise because he could get away with it. He was building treaties and he was building relationships with the nations by having, instead of making a peace treaty and signing it, by having wives. That's what he did. The other part is to think of him being king, to consider in our minds, we have a king over us. Now, he happens to love us, but he's still a king. We have to respect authority because we've been trained not to respect authority. And we're getting into a time in our lives where authority is rejected and criticized and objected to. And God will not tolerate that when it comes to his holiness. We're under grace and he loves us, but there's a certain amount of place where we have to respect that God is still God, that he has a certain amount of holiness that's going to cause you to fall flat on your face, to back off of your attitudes about a lot of things that you may get away with now. But once you see God as he is, you won't have any question as to being overwhelmed by his purity, by his solemnity, by how great and how much bigger he is than we are. That's why in this book you need to kind of grasp it as being, it's not all about fun and games, and it's not all about too serious, but we're talking about eternal values, eternal truths, things that are going to go on forever and ever and ever and ever. So if it says there's a scroll in heaven, it's not joking. The Bible is true, we're not. It doesn't matter whether you understand it or not. That's too bad for you. So sad, too bad. That's the way that God looks at it. Because Jesus said, look, I've explained to you what is happening in heaven. If you can't receive it, that's not my fault. That's yours. And so there's a truth to the love of God poured out upon you. There's a truth to the grace that God has given you. But there's also a truth to the responsibility of the action and suffering the consequences of reaping what you sow. And that's why Proverbs, reaping what you sow, is a proverb. That's why Proverbs is so key issue to teaching you how to have God's sense of what you're doing, how you're acting, what you believe in, and where you're going to get problems in your life from you. Because majority of your problems are self-inflicted. A majority of your solutions can come from Proverbs if you learn how to be proverbial in your way of examining the life that you're living around you. I do believe out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks, there's a proverb that reveals that. And that's one big issue about how you can see a lot of things, how the truth is made manifest by what's written and contained in the Word of God. So let's stop here at verse 1 as an introduction. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. And imagine, if you were, being a servant in the court of the king, you know, like King Arthur days. And imagine that you had a sword, you know, and that you were a knight, and that you were standing there, and you saw Solomon on a throne talking to his scribe and saying these things out loud. That's the image that I'd like you to think about. Think about Solomon on a throne talking to a scribe, and you're standing there like one of King Arthur's swordsmen, or King Arthur's court, or a person that's in the court of the king listening to what God is saying through Solomon, because Solomon was the wisest man, and he was noted for being so smart that literally wisdom dripped out of his lips, is what it says. Literally, that the beauty of holiness was contained in the words that Solomon was crafted and able to being able to speak. He would be so charismatic with his words, maybe not his demeanor, I don't know, but his words were so charismatic that they brought you to a place of admiring him. And that's how he became king over Israel. God anointed him, but he would not have kept the kingdom had it not been for the wisdom God put in him. Otherwise, he was just a brat from David's court, to put it bluntly. And that, sadly, is because of his relationship that he had with his mother, and the fact that Bathsheba had come from David's illicit relationship. And so we have quite a few interesting things to examine when we go through this, looking at and realizing, hey, Proverbs isn't like anything we have today. And we don't. We have things like, you know, we say, oh, well, you know, cleanliness is next to godliness, but that doesn't make you go out and clean, does it? No, it doesn't. We have things like a penny saved is a penny earned, but you don't save your pennies, do you? But if I said to you something like, if you were at a racetrack and we said, check it and bet it, well, that's not a good one. I can't even think of check it and bet it. It doesn't even rhyme. Can't think of a proverb off the top of my head that's modern, but we're going to have proverbs that will compare them and then try to come up with a modern day cliche or modern day example of common sense ideas that we kind of say things the same way, or we do things that way that would apply to our present situation. So let's think of something that we could say is a king proverb, or some kind of proverb that we could take out of verse 1 that we could make part for our lives to give us some common sense, so that when we look at Proverbs we can think of it. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. Son he was, but king he is, and of that which he know. I can't even come up with one today. It's interesting that it would be that way. But if the Lord doesn't want to give us a proverb, you know, that's okay. The Proverbs of Solomon. The Proverbs. The way to be. What do you want to be? There we go. The Proverbs. To be or not to be. Do you want to be king? Then learn wisdom. Do you want to be like Solomon? You know, many wise? I don't recommend that. But do you want to be recorded in the book of life as having wisdom? Do you want to be recorded in your book as having common sense or smart sense or God sense? Do you want to be what you can be and be all you could be according to the Proverbs, which is what ProVerbs, to be positive about what you could be? Because in the same way that the word is called I am, the same word is used for to be. And to be and I am are the same, because God uses it to say that I will be what I will be to my people. I will be as I choose to be. What they need me to be, I will be. And that whole phraseology covers the reality of the simple I am statement that we read in the Old Testament. And so in Proverbs, the same thing may be true. In the sense of I am, the proverb is what you ought to be. You ought to be learning these things. You ought to be doing these things. You ought to be applying these things. So that's what we'll do. We'll call Proverbs to be or not to be. Proverbs. That's our proverb. There we go. Hey, wow, that solved it. Boy, it took a little rabbit out of my hat. But presto, we have our first proverb. We have our rephrasing of verse 1. The Proverbs, to be or not to be. That's the question. So will we be what we ought to be, or will we be what we don't want to be? That's what we'll do in Proverbs. God bless you.